She signed the papers without looking at him. That was what broke Adrian Vaughn first. Not the finality of the documents, not the attorney's quiet voice reading terms he had already memorized, not even the sound of the pen scratching across the last page of their marriage. It was the fact that Evelyn never once lifted her eyes to his face. 7 years. And she signed him away like a lease agreement she was relieved to be done with. He watched her hand move across the paper, steady, deliberate, and felt something in his chest that he refused to name. He had prepared for this. He had told himself on the drive over that he was ready. He was not ready. But Adrian Vaughn did not show things. That was the first thing anyone who knew him understood. So he sat across the mahogany table in the law office on 53rd Street, his jaw locked, his posture controlled, and he watched his wife, his ex-wife now, in the space of a signature, push the papers back across the table. And he picked up the pen. If you've stayed with this story this far, do me one favor before we go any further. Hit that like button and drop a comment with the name of the city where you're watching from. I want to see how far this story has traveled. Now let's go back to where it all began to fall apart. The law office was on the 31st floor of a building that caught light badly in the afternoon. By 2 o'clock, the room was washed in a flat, gray brightness that made everyone in it look slightly ill. Evelyn had noticed that when she walked in. She'd thought, of course. Of course the room where she ended her marriage would have unflattering lighting and a water pitcher no one touched and a paralegal in the corner who kept glancing at her watch. There were 4 people in the room. Evelyn, Adrian, Margaret Hollis, Evelyn's attorney, who had the particular gift of looking both compassionate and entirely unbothered at the same time, and a man named Gerald Pierce, who represented Adrian and who had not once, in the 3 months of proceedings, made eye contact with Evelyn. She didn't take it personally. She suspected Gerald Pierce simply did not look at things he considered already resolved. The final documents had been couriered over that morning. Both attorneys had reviewed them the previous week. There was nothing left to negotiate. The apartment in Manhattan would be sold. The house in Connecticut, Adrian's really, purchased before their marriage, would remain his. The investment accounts had been divided. There was no dispute about property because Evelyn had stopped fighting about property around the time she stopped fighting about everything else. She had asked for very little. Margaret had pushed back on that more than once in the privacy of their consultations. You're entitled to significantly more, Evelyn. And Evelyn had said, I know. I don't want it. What she meant but didn't say was that she wanted to be able to walk out of this marriage without carrying anything that still smelled like him. The papers were thick. 43 pages, which felt obscene for a document whose essential message was, these 2 people are no longer each other's problem. But Gerald Pierce had insisted on comprehensiveness, and Margaret had matched him paragraph for paragraph, and so there were 43 pages describing the dissolution of what had once been, in a hotel room in Rome on a Tuesday night in October, the most alive Evelyn had ever felt in her adult life. She read every page, not because she expected surprises, but because she needed to do it. She needed to sit with each clause and feel its weight and let herself understand fully that this was real. Adrian sat across from her and did not speak. She was aware of him the way you are aware of a fire in a room, not looking directly at it, but conscious of its heat, its presence, the way it altered the air around it. He was wearing a dark blue suit, no tie, which was how he dressed when he wanted to appear approachable without sacrificing authority. She knew his wardrobe the way she knew the sound of his car in the driveway. She knew every deliberate choice he made about how he presented himself to the world. After 7 years, she could read his performance like a familiar script. What she could not read, had never been able to read, was what was underneath it. She reached the last page. She read it twice. Then she picked up the pen that Margaret had placed near her right hand, and she signed her name. Evelyn Marie Carter. She had gone back to Carter 3 weeks ago, legally, before any of this was finalized, because she needed to do at least one thing first. She needed to stop being Evelyn Vaughn before she was ready to stop being his wife. She pushed the papers across the table. There was a silence that lasted maybe 4 seconds. Then she heard the sound of Adrian picking up the pen. She did not look at him. She stared at a point just past Margaret's shoulder, a framed print on the wall, something abstract in blue and charcoal. and she breathed slowly and she waited. She heard the scratch of his signature once, twice, 3 times on the pages that required it. "That concludes the signing," Gerald Pierce said. Margaret said something in response. The paralegal gathered the documents. Someone opened a folder. Evelyn stood up. She had planned to shake Adrian's hand. She had actually rehearsed it alone in her apartment the night before, because she was that kind of person. The kind who rehearsed difficult moments to keep herself from drowning in them. A handshake, civil, clean, the kind of ending that left both people with their dignity. She pushed her chair back. She picked up her bag. She took one step toward the door, and then the floor came up to meet her. Tet. She didn't feel herself fall. That was the strange thing she would remember later, in pieces. That there was no sensation of descent, no moment where her body warned her. One second she was upright and moving, and the next second she was on the floor, and the carpet was pressed against her cheek, and it smelled like cleaning solution and old wood, and she could hear voices, but they were coming from far away, like they were in another room. Evelyn, that was Margaret, or possibly the paralegal. She couldn't be sure. "Call 911. That voice was closer, low, controlled, but with an edge underneath it she recognized immediately, even from the floor, even half-conscious. Adrian. She felt his hand on her face before she saw him, his palm against her cheek, tilting her head slightly. She opened her eyes and his face was above her, and for a disorienting moment she thought, he looked scared, which was wrong, which was not a thing she had ever seen Adrian Vaughn look. "Evelyn, stay with me." "I'm fine," she said. Her voice came out wrong. Thin and far away. "You're not fine. You're on the floor. Don't move." "I don't need—" "Stop talking." And then, quieter. "Please." That please. She would think about that later. She had not heard him say please like that in a long time. Like it cost him something. Like he was willing to pay it. She closed her eyes again. Isam. The paramedics arrived in 11 minutes. Evelyn was conscious by the time they got there, sitting up against Margaret's arm, insisting she was fine in a voice that convinced no one. Her blood pressure was low. Her skin was cold. She had not eaten that morning, she admitted, because the thought of food had made her nauseous for the past several weeks, and she had attributed it to stress, because her life had contained very little besides stress for the past year. And it seemed reasonable. "We're going to take you in," the paramedic said. "That's really not necessary." "Evelyn." Margaret's voice was firm. "Go." She looked up. Adrian was standing near the door. He had taken off his jacket at some point, she didn't know when, and his sleeves were rolled to the elbows in a way that meant he had been doing something with his hands, which was what he did when he was trying not to lose control of himself. He was watching her with an expression she didn't know how to categorize. "I'll follow," he said. "You don't have to do that." "I know." St. Luke's was 12 blocks north. The emergency intake was efficient, which surprised her, because in her experience, nothing in New York moved quickly unless it was bad news. They took her blood pressure again, drew blood, asked her a series of questions in the quick, neutral tone of people who had asked the same questions 10,000 times. She was in a curtained bay, alone, when the attending physician came in. He was young, younger than she expected, with the particular careful stillness of someone delivering information he has been trained to deliver carefully. "Ms. Carter," he said, "how are you feeling?" "Better. My head is clearer." "Good." He paused, looked at his tablet, looked at her. "I want to ask you something before we go over your results. When was your last menstrual period?" She opened her mouth to answer and then stopped. She counted back, and counted back again. The room felt very quiet. "Ms. Carter?" She stopped. "I'm not sure. I've been under a lot of stress. My cycle has been irregular." "That's common," he said. He paused again, in that particular way physicians pause when they are giving you the half-second you need to catch up to what they're about to say. "We ran a standard panel. One of the tests we include is a pregnancy test." Another pause. "It came back positive." She heard the words. She understood them individually. Together they refused to arrange themselves into meaning. "That's—" She stopped. "That has to be an error." It's possible for tests to give false results, he said, but it's uncommon. We'd like to do a confirmatory blood draw and, if you're willing, an ultrasound. Given that you fainted and your blood pressure is low, we want to make sure we understand what's happening. She nodded. She wasn't sure she had chosen to nod. Her body just did it. Is there someone in the waiting room we should speak to? A family member or... No, she said. Then, yes, there might be someone. She paused. Don't tell him anything yet. The ultrasound was performed 40 minutes later in a room that was too cold and smelled faintly of antiseptic and the particular silence of serious things. The technician was a woman named Rosa, who had kind eyes and said very little, which Evelyn was grateful for. When the image appeared on the screen, Evelyn turned her head to look at it. She didn't know what she expected to feel. What she felt was something that had no clean name, a slow, enormous thing moving through her chest, like a tide coming in. There was a shape on the screen, small, unmistakable. A rapid flutter that Rosa pointed to and said, "That's the heartbeat, strong." "How far along?" Evelyn asked. Her voice was very quiet. "Based on measurements, approximately 12 weeks, possibly 13. Rosa glanced at her. "I'll have the doctor confirm." 12 weeks. Evelyn lay in that cold room and did the math she did not want to do. 12 weeks ago was February. February was the month Adrian had shown up at her apartment, the one she'd been renting since September after she moved out, because she'd left a scarf at the house in Connecticut and he'd driven an hour and a half to return it. And she had looked at him standing in her doorway with her scarf in his hand, and she had known it wasn't about the scarf. And she had let him in anyway, because she was tired and because it had been raining and because some part of her that she was not proud of was not done with him yet, even when the rest of her was. That was February. She stared at the ceiling of the ultrasound room and thought, of all the things. Ikis. Dr. Amara Ose was the attending who came to speak to her afterward. The young physician from before, joined now by a colleague, which felt significant. They sat with her in the bay and confirmed what the ultrasound showed, approximately 12 to 13 weeks. The fainting episode was consistent with low blood pressure in early pregnancy, compounded by inadequate nutrition and elevated stress. The baby appeared, from initial scans, to be developing normally. "You'll want to establish care with an OB as soon as possible," Dr. Ose said. "Given the fainting episode, we'd like to monitor your blood pressure closely, but there's nothing here that suggests the pregnancy is at risk." She nodded. "Do you have questions?" She had approximately 400 questions, none of which Dr. Ose could answer. "No," she said. "Thank you." He stood, paused at the curtain. "There's a man in the waiting room who has asked about you 4 times in the last hour. He said he's your..." He checked his notes. "Your ex-husband, as of today, apparently." "Yes." "Would you like us to tell him you're ready for a visitor?" She looked at the ceiling, at the fluorescent light, at the nothing directly above her. "Give me 5 minutes," she said. She used 3 of them, then she said, "Send him in." Adrian did not say anything when he came through the curtain. He looked at her. Lying in the hospital bed, still in the gray blazer she'd worn to the signing, the paper gown the nurses had given her folded across her lap because she'd refused to change completely, and something moved across his face that he did not try to hide, which was unusual enough that she noticed it. He pulled a chair to the side of the bed and sat down. Not at a distance. Close. The way you sit next to someone when you need to be able to hear them clearly. "What did they say?" he asked. She looked at him. His face was familiar in the way that all things you have looked at for years become familiar. The line of his jaw, the slight tension around his eyes that never fully relaxed, the way he held himself even when he was sitting, like he was always ready to stand. She said, "I'm pregnant." The silence that followed was the longest she had ever sat in. Adrian's face did something she could not describe. It moved through several things in the space of a few seconds. A kind of shock, then something underneath it, then something underneath that, until she could not read what was on the surface anymore because there were too many layers moving at once. "How far?" he said. His voice was steady, just barely. 12 weeks. He absorbed that. She watched him absorb it. She She watched the calculation happen. She could always tell when Adrian was calculating. There was a particular stillness in him, and she watched it complete. He said, "February?" "Yes." He put his elbow on the rail of the bed and pressed his fist against his mouth. He stared at the curtain for a long moment, then he looked back at her. "Are you—" He stopped, started again. "How are you? Are you okay?" "They say the pregnancy looks normal. The feigning was low blood pressure. I haven't been eating well." "Evelyn." "I'm fine, Adrian. You passed out on the floor of a law office." "I'm aware." "That is not fine." She looked at the ceiling. "I didn't know," she said. "I want you to understand that. I did not know. If I had known, I would have—" She stopped because she didn't know how to finish that sentence. What would she have done? She had no answer that was honest and also comfortable, so she left the sentence where it was. "I know you didn't know," he said. His voice was quieter now. "That's not what I'm—" He exhaled. "I'm not accusing you of anything. You're not accusing me, but you're counting back to February, and you're wondering if that night changed anything about how we got here." He didn't answer. "Go ahead," she said. "Wonder it out loud if you need to." "That's not what I'm doing." "Adrian." He met her eyes. "Would it have changed anything?" he asked. And there was something raw underneath the question, something he was trying to contain and not quite managing. "If you'd known, would we have—" "I don't know," she said. "That's the only honest answer I have." He nodded slowly, like he had expected that answer, and it still landed harder than he'd prepared for. The curtain shifted slightly in the air from the hallway beyond it. Somewhere outside, a cartwheel squeaked against tile. The hospital moved around them, indifferent. "I want to be involved," he said. "I know you do. That's not a request for anything right now. I need you to know that." She looked at him, at the man she had spent 7 years with, at the man she had learned to love, and then learned to fear, and then learned to grieve, and then signed away on 43 pieces of paper an hour and a half ago, at the man who had driven 90 minutes in February to return a scarf, and she had let him in, and now she was lying in a hospital bed with 12 weeks of consequence between them. "I know," she said again. The silence this time was different. It wasn't comfortable, say. She didn't think silence between them would be comfortable again for a very long time, possibly ever. But it was honest, and for the first time in longer than she could accurately remember, honest felt like enough. She turned her head toward the small frosted window in the wall. The afternoon light was fading. Outside, the city was doing what it always did, moving, indifferent, continuous, without any awareness that 2 people in a curtained bay on its east side had just had their endings canceled. She rested her hand on her stomach, just lightly. She wasn't sure why. Behind her, she heard Adrian's breath catch, but a small fractured sound, quickly controlled. She did not turn around, but she did not move her hand. They kept her for observation until 7 in the evening. Margaret Hollis called twice and Evelyn answered the second time and gave her the minimum necessary information in the tone of a person who has used up all available emotional bandwidth and needs the conversation to be brief. Margaret was, to her credit, brief. Adrian stayed. She didn't ask him to. She didn't ask him to leave either. He sat in the chair beside her bed, and he was quiet, which was the one thing he had always been genuinely good at, being present without requiring anything from the presence. That had been one of the things she had loved about him, early on, before she understood that his silence could also be a door that locked from the inside. A nurse named Denise came in at 5:30 to check her blood pressure and left a pamphlet on the bed. "Your first trimester, what to expect." Evelyn looked at it for a moment and then turned it face down. "You should read it," Adrian said. "I'll read it at home." "I could—" He stopped. She looked at him. He was looking at the pamphlet. He had his hands loosely clasped between his knees, which was a posture she'd rarely seen on him, something almost humble in it. "I was going to say I could come with you, to your apartment, to make sure you—" He stopped again, looked up. "That's not appropriate." "No," she agreed. "Okay. You can call," she said. "Tonight. To check." He looked at her for a moment. Then he nodded once. "Okay?" At 7, Dr. Osei came back with discharge instructions. a referral for an OB, and a prescription for prenatal vitamins. He shook Evelyn's hand. He looked at Adrian, who had stood when the doctor entered, with a glance that was professionally neutral and somehow still managed to take in the entire situation. "Take care of yourself," Dr. Osei said to Evelyn. "I will." "Both of you," he said, and then corrected himself, and looked at her stomach for half a second, and she understood what he meant and said nothing. In the elevator going down, she and Adrian stood on opposite sides. The doors reflected them both, his height, her stillness, the distance between them. She watched the floors descend on the panel above the doors. In the lobby, she stopped. "My car is north," she said. "I know. Mine's in the garage on 56th. He paused. "I'll walk you." She wanted to say no. She had been wanting to say no to Adrian for 4 years in various forms and with varying degrees of success. But she was tired, and her head still felt fragile, and the city outside the glass doors was loud and bright in the way it always was at the end of the day, full of people going places with purpose. "Okay," she said. They walked out together into the cold air of early May, and the city opened around them, and neither of them spoke. But he walked slightly to her left, positioning himself between her and the traffic, which was an old habit of his, one of the ones she had never thought to resent, and she noticed it and said nothing. They walked 1 block, then 2. At the corner of 54th, she stopped at the light. He stopped beside her. The sign above them cycled to walk, and the crowd around them began to move, and she stood still for 1 more second, watching the green man blink. Then she said without looking at him, "We're going to have to figure out what this is." "I know," he said. "Not tonight." "No." "But soon." "Yes." The light began to cycle back. She stepped off the curb and into the current of people, and he followed, a half step behind, and the city absorbed them both. He called at 9:17. She was sitting on her kitchen floor with her back against the cabinet under the sink, which was not something she could explain rationally. It was simply where she had ended up after she'd come home and dropped her bag by the door and stood in the middle of her apartment for several minutes without being able to identify what she needed to do next. The floor was cold through her slacks, and she hadn't turned on most of the lights, and the prenatal vitamin prescription was still in her coat pocket, unread. Her phone lit up on the tile beside her. His name. She looked at it for 2 rings, then she picked up. "I'm home," she said before he could ask. A pause. "Okay." Another pause. "Did you eat?" "Not yet." "Evelyn?" "I was going to." She leaned her head back against the cabinet. "I just sat down for a minute." "What did you eat today?" "Before." She thought about it. Coffee at 6 in the morning, half a piece of toast that she'd thrown away because the smell of the butter had turned her stomach. Nothing after that. "Enough," she said. He didn't respond immediately, which meant he didn't believe her. She could read his silences the way other people read faces. "I'm going to order something," she said. "I'll eat. You don't have to worry about that part." "I'm not." He stopped, tried again. "I'm going to worry about it. That's not something I can turn off." She didn't argue with that. It was true and they both knew it, and the complicated thing about Adrian's worrying was that it was real. It had always been real. It was just that the line between concern and control was one he had never been able to see clearly, and neither of them had understood that for a very long time. "I have the name of an OB, she said, "from the referral. I'll call in the morning." "Good. I'll send you the appointment information when I have it." "You don't have to." "Adrian." She closed her eyes. "I know what this is. I know what you're trying not to ask for. I'm telling you I'll send you the information because it's the right thing to do, not because you pushed for it." A long quiet. "Okay," he said finally. "Thank you." "Go home," she said. "Get some sleep. We'll figure out the rest later." She heard him breathe in, heard him hold it for a second, the way he did when he was closing something off inside himself. "Good night, Evelyn." "Good night." She sat on the kitchen floor for another 20 minutes after she hung up. Then she ordered soup from the Thai place 2 blocks over, ate half of it at the counter standing up, and went to bed at 10 o'clock without washing her face. It was the most practical she had managed to be in months. She was asleep before she could think about Rome, But in the morning, she thought about Rome. It had started in October, the way most significant things in Evelyn's life had started. Not with fanfare, but with accident. She had been in Rome for a conference on urban architecture and sustainable infrastructure, which sounds impressive and was mostly exhausting. 4 days of panels and presentations in a converted palazzo near the Tiber, followed by networking dinners she attended dutifully and left early. On the third evening, she'd skipped the dinner entirely. She'd found a small restaurant 6 streets from the hotel, the kind with no English on the menu and paper placemats and a single candle on each table that burned inconsistently. She'd ordered by pointing. She'd brought a book she hadn't opened. And she'd been sitting alone with a glass of wine that was better than it had any right to be, watching rain come down on the cobblestones outside the window when a man had appeared at her table. "I think I have your reservation," he said. His Italian was good, but his accent was American, and something about that combination was immediately interesting. She looked at the table, then at him. "I don't think so." "The host seems to think I do. Every other table is taken, and he's doing a gesture that I believe means—" He demonstrated something vaguely diplomatic. "Sharing is a viable option." She looked around the restaurant. It was, in fact, entirely full. The host was watching them from the doorway with the patient expression of a man who had seen this exact situation resolve itself many times. "Sit down," she said. That was the beginning. His name was Adrian Vaughn. He was in Rome for an acquisition, a company his firm was absorbing, something in logistics and supply chain infrastructure, the details of which he explained with the particular precision of someone who finds what he does genuinely interesting, which she found unexpectedly engaging. He asked questions. Real ones, Pom. Not the cocktail party kind designed to fill space until you could talk about yourself again, but questions where he actually waited for the answer and then asked a follow-up based on what he'd heard. She was an architect. She worked for a firm in New York designing public spaces and transit infrastructure. She was good at her job and mostly satisfied with her life, which was not the same as happy but was stable, and stability had counted for something at that point in her life. They stayed until the restaurant closed. The host brought the check with an expression of sincere satisfaction. Outside in the wet street, Adrian had looked at her with a directness she wasn't accustomed to in men she'd just met. "I'm going to ask for your number," he said. "And I want to be straightforward about it because I find games exhausting, and I suspect you do too." She laughed. She hadn't expected to laugh. "That's an interesting approach. Does it work?" She gave him her number. It worked. They had dated for 8 months before she fully understood what she was dealing with. Not because he hid himself, she would not have said that, even now. It was more that the qualities that later became problems were, in the early months, the qualities that made him remarkable. He was attentive in a way she'd never experienced. He noticed things. He remembered things. He anticipated what she needed before she knew she needed it, and he moved through the world with a kind of quiet competence that made her feel, in a way she couldn't quite articulate, taken care of. She had not been taken care of in a very long time. Her mother was dead and her father was distant, and her late 20s had been largely a project in self-sufficiency. Adrian's attention was at first like water in a dry place. She understood the problem later. The attentiveness was real, but it did not originate entirely from generosity. It also came from a need, specific and persistent, to understand every variable in his environment. Adrian Vaughn did not like uncertainty. He did not like things he couldn't predict or account for. And the way he resolved uncertainty, in all areas of his life, was to gather information and exercise control. With his company, this made him exceptional. With his wife, it made him suffocating. It happened in increments. That was the thing nobody warned you about, that it didn't arrive all at once in a recognizable shape. It arrived as small adjustments. A preference stated. A suggestion that became a habit that became an expectation. A dinner she'd planned with a colleague that Adrian had quietly, carefully, persistently questioned. Not the dinner itself, never anything that direct, but the colleague, the restaurant, her being out on that particular evening. Had she mentioned it earlier? Was she sure it wasn't too far? He could come pick her up after. She canceled the dinner, not because he asked her to, because it was easier than the questions. That was the first one. There were others. By the time she fully understood the pattern, she had been inside it for 3 years, and it had the texture of her ordinary life. She had quit the firm. Adrian had expressed, with great care and no ultimatum, that he worried about her hours, her stress levels, the commute, the travel, and she was working freelance from their apartment, which meant she was home when he came home, which meant he always knew where she was. She had a small group of friends who had quietly contracted over time, because maintaining friendships required the kind of energy and spontaneity that was hard to sustain in an environment where her social engagements were always, somehow, subject to review. She had stopped wearing the red dress because he had said once, 2 years earlier, that it seemed like it was drawing attention she might not want, and somehow she had absorbed that sentence and let it rearrange her. She had disappeared into the life he had built, and not noticed it happening until it was already done. The moment she understood, fully, with clarity and without the softening lens of love that had blurred everything for so long, came in the middle of a Tuesday in March. She was sitting at her desk, working on plans for a transit shelter redesign she'd been commissioned for, a project she genuinely liked, and her phone buzzed. A text from her friend Nina, who she hadn't seen in 4 months. "Coffee this week?" She had typed, "I'll check with Adrian," and stared at those 4 words, and felt something shift under her sternum like a plate moving. She hadn't deleted the message. She'd sat with it for 10 minutes, and then she'd typed to Nina, "Yes, Wednesday at 2. I'll meet you." She did not check with Adrian. She did not tell Adrian until that evening, and she watched the particular micro-expressions that moved across his face, the slight tightening, the controlled blink, the smile that appeared to make the tightening acceptable. And she understood that she had made an error according to a set of rules she had not agreed to, and yet had somehow been following for years. She had gone to coffee with Nina. She had come home. Adrian had not said anything about it. But for the rest of that week, something in the atmosphere of their apartment was different, cooler, more careful. A kind of silence that had texture. She started keeping notes after that. Not dramatic notes. She wasn't looking to build a case. She was simply trying to see the pattern clearly, the way you look at something from a different angle to understand its actual shape. And once she started looking at it clearly, she couldn't stop. 6 months later, she asked for a divorce. "Ba?" Adrian had not argued. That surprised her. She had prepared for argument, had rehearsed multiple versions of the conversation in her head, anticipated objections, mapped out how she would hold her ground. Instead, he had sat very still for a long time and then said, "Is there anything I can do?" "No," she said. "No, Adrian." He had nodded. He had accepted it with the same controlled stillness with which he accepted everything, and that in itself broke something in her because she had wanted, she could admit this only to herself, some evidence that he had understood the weight of what was being said. Some crack in the composure. Some evidence that the years had cost him something. But that was not who he was. He contained himself. He always had. She hired Margaret Hollis. He hired Gerald Pierce. And they had spent the next 10 months negotiating, in the polite and catastrophically expensive language of attorneys, the terms under which 2 people who had once shared everything would share nothing. The OB appointment was 2 weeks after the hospital discharge. Dr. Rachel Ewan had an office on the Upper East Side and a manner that was direct without being cold, which was the exact balance Evelyn needed and had been prepared to go through multiple referrals to find. She had told her the situation simply. Recently divorced, 12 weeks along, the pregnancy was unplanned. The other parent would be involved. Doctor. Ewan had written notes and not reacted to any of it, which Evelyn deeply appreciated. Blood pressure is better than the ER reading, which is reassuring. Let's talk about what the next several weeks look like. Adrian was in the waiting room. She had told him the appointment time, and he had appeared, punctual, which he always was, in the lobby of the building at 9:48. She had not invited him into the exam room, and he had not asked. He was there when she came out 35 minutes later, sitting in a chair near the window with his phone in his hand, and he looked up when she appeared. "Well?" he asked. "Everything looks good. She wants to see me in 4 weeks. Second trimester ultrasound at 16 weeks. He nodded, then carefully. "Can I come to that one?" She studied him. He looked, she thought, like a man trying very hard not to want something too visibly. "Yes," she said. "You can come to that one." Something moved across his face and was quickly settled. Thank you. They walked out of the building into the April morning, which had turned unexpectedly warm. The street smelled like coffee from the shop on the corner and something green from the park 2 blocks over, and the light was the particular bright clarity of spring before the humidity arrived. Can I buy you breakfast? He asked. She looked at him. This isn't... She stopped. I don't want you to think that attending appointments means I know what it means, he said. I'm asking if you've eaten breakfast because you have a documented tendency to skip meals and you're growing a person. And there's a diner on 82nd that I know you like because we went there twice and you said the eggs were the best you'd had in New York. She looked at him for a long moment. He was telling the truth about the diner, about why he was asking. She could tell when Adrian was maneuvering, and this wasn't it. This was something simpler. A man who noticed what people needed and could not, even now, stop noticing. Fine, she said, but I'm paying for myself. Obviously. The diner was half full on a Wednesday morning, populated by the usual mix of retirees and people with irregular work schedules, and a group of what appeared to be Columbia students doing the kind of studying that mostly consists of talking. They got a booth in the back. Evelyn ordered eggs and toast and orange juice, and Adrian ordered coffee and the same eggs because he had never been particularly inventive about breakfast, which was one of the small things she actually missed about living with him. He was a good cook for dinner, patient with complicated things, but breakfast he had always treated as purely functional, coffee and whatever was closest. How are you sleeping? He asked. Badly, which is apparently normal in the first trimester. What does it feel like, the nausea? She looked up from her orange juice. Are you asking because you're curious or because you think there's something you can do about it? He considered this. Both, mostly the first one. It's not always nausea. Sometimes it's just that things smell wrong, like someone has adjusted the calibration on every smell in my environment by about 15% and nothing sits right. She paused. The coffee in this diner, for example, smells fine right now. Last week, the smell of my neighbor's coffee through the wall made me have to leave my apartment. I could get decaf. Your coffee is fine, Adrian. I'm not going to manage your coffee. He wrapped his hands around the mug and didn't say anything for a moment. Then, I've been reading. About? Pregnancy, first trimester, what to expect from he paused, from the other person's perspective. She looked at him. You've been reading pregnancy books? Articles, mostly. One book. I ordered it 2 days after the hospital. She did not know what to do with this information. She filed it somewhere and moved on. And? I understand I'm going to be peripheral for a lot of this, physically. I can't be the one it's happening to. I'm just trying to understand it so I can be... He stopped. Useful, without being too much, she said. Yes. The eggs arrived. She put hot sauce on hers and he watched her do it and didn't say anything, which 2 years ago he would have commented on because he had a thing about hot sauce before noon, which she had always found slightly absurd and which had become, like many slightly absurd things, a point of quiet friction. She noticed that he didn't say anything. She noticed that she noticed. I want to ask you something, she said, and I need you to answer it honestly. Okay. Do you understand why I left? He was quiet for a moment. Not calculating quiet, the other kind. The kind that meant he was genuinely sitting with the question. I understand it more now than I did when you asked for the divorce, he said. He exhaled. I'm still working on understanding all of it. The honest answer is that I've spent most of the last 10 months telling myself a version of it that probably lets me off easier than the truth does. She looked at him. That's the most honest thing you've said to me in years. He winced slightly. Not dramatically, barely perceptible, but it was there. I know. I didn't leave because I stopped loving you. She said it carefully, like something that needed to be placed precisely. I left because I was disappearing inside the life you had us living, and I didn't know how to stop it while I was still in it. And the most painful part was that you never meant to do it. I know you never meant to do it. That's not... He stopped. That's not a defense. No, it's not. Evelyn. He put down his fork. I'm not looking for one. I'm not trying to... I'm not sitting here because I think I can convince you that I fixed something in 2 weeks. I know I haven't. I know I don't even fully understand what's broken." He paused. "I'm sitting here because we're having a baby and I want to figure out what that means, and I didn't want to do it over the phone." She looked at the table, at her eggs, at the small pool of hot sauce on the side of the plate. "Okay," she said. "Okay? We figure it out." She picked up her fork. "Not all at once, not today. But we figure it out." He nodded. He picked up his own fork. They ate in a silence that wasn't comfortable and wasn't hostile and was, she supposed, honest, which was more than they'd managed in a long time. Outside the window, the street moved in its ordinary Tuesday rhythm. A woman pushed a stroller. A delivery man double-parked and didn't care. The light changed, and the crowd at the intersection reshuffled itself, and nobody noticed two people in a corner booth trying to locate the beginning of a language they hadn't spoken in years. The weeks that followed were careful. That was the best word for it. Careful. Adrian called every few days. Not every day, which she suspected required effort on his part, because Adrian's instinct was always toward more contact, more information, more certainty about the state of things. But he called on Tuesdays and Thursdays and Sunday evenings, and the calls were brief and specific and did not mostly trespass. He asked about her health, about how she was sleeping, about the prenatal vitamin prescription she had filled, eventually, after the pharmacist had looked at her receipt in a way that communicated appropriate medical concern. He did not ask where she was going or who she was seeing or what her schedule looked like. He did not suggest things she should or shouldn't do in the way he once had, beneath the surface of a gentle observation, reliable as a tide. She noticed the effort. She didn't thank him for it, because she wasn't sure that thanking someone for not controlling you was something she was willing to do. But she noticed. Nina noticed too, in the way that friends who have known you a long time notice things before you name them. "You seem less," Nina had started to say, sitting across from Evelyn at the coffee shop on Bleecker they'd reclaimed as theirs over the past several months, since Evelyn had moved to the apartment 6 blocks from it. "I don't know," Les braced. "That's a strange thing to say. You've been braced since before you filed, like you were constantly waiting for something to hit you." Nina cupped her hands around her latte. She was a ceramicist who made enough money at it to be surprised, with the chronic practicality of a middle child who was raised to expect less. She was one of the people who had contracted from Evelyn's life during the marriage and had reappeared, without comment, the week Evelyn signed her apartment lease. "Is it the pregnancy? Or is it him?" "Both, probably." "Are you two?" "No," Evelyn said. "We're not anything. We're co-parenting something that isn't born yet and trying not to make it worse than it has to be." Nina looked at her with the particular expression that meant she had an opinion and was deciding whether it was wanted. Evelyn shook her head slightly. Nina drank her latte. "I'm not saying it's wrong," Nina said eventually. "I'm just saying be careful with what you let be provisional." Evelyn turned that sentence over in her head for several days without arriving at an answer she liked. At 16 weeks, they went to the ultrasound together. The technician, different from Rosa, a man this time, efficient and pleasant in the way of people who perform joyful procedures 40 times a week, and have found a sustainable relationship with that joy. Moved the wand across her abdomen, and the image appeared on the screen, and this time it was different. Not the small flicker of 12 weeks, but something unmistakably formed. A profile. A nose. A hand. The technician pointed to it, a fist curled near the face. "Moving a lot," the technician said. "Active baby." Evelyn stared at the screen. She heard Adrian, in the chair beside her, very quietly say nothing at all. She didn't look at him. She was looking at the image. But she heard the nothing, and inside it she could hear the precise quality of his stillness. Not controlled stillness, not the performative composure she knew so well. Something else. The stillness of someone who has been struck. "Do you want to know the sex?" the technician asked. She looked at Adrian. He was looking at the screen. She could see the side of his face, the set of his jaw, the way his hands were on his knees, perfectly still, like he didn't trust what they might do if he let them move. "Do you?" she asked him. He looked at her. His eyes were... She looked away before she could finish that thought. "Whatever you want," he said. "I asked you." That he was quiet for a second. Yes, he said. I want to know. She looked at the technician. Tell us. It's a boy, the technician said. The room was very quiet. Then Adrian said so quietly she almost didn't catch it. A boy. She didn't say anything. She looked at the screen, at the profile, at the curled hand. Outside, after, they stood on the sidewalk in the yellow-gray light of a city afternoon. She had the printed ultrasound image in a small envelope the technician had given her. Adrian had his hands in his pockets. A boy, he said again, like he needed to say it again to believe it. A boy, she agreed. He looked at her. There was something on his face that she had never seen there in 7 years of marriage. An openness, unguarded and unperformed, that made him look briefly like someone she didn't fully know. Younger, maybe. More breakable. I don't know how to do this right, he said. I need you to know that I know that. Knowing it is different from doing it differently, she said. I know that too. She looked at him for a long moment. We have about 23 weeks to figure out what differently looks like, she said. We should probably start. He nodded. He pulled his hands out of his pockets and looked at them briefly, like he was checking they were still there. Then he looked back at her. Can I see the picture? She opened the envelope and handed it to him. He took it and held it and looked at it in the way you look at things that rearrange you without your permission. She watched him look at it. She let him have the moment without filling it. After a while, he handed it back. Thank you, he said. And she understood, from the way he said it, that he was not just thanking her for the photograph. She put it back in the envelope. She tucked it into her bag. Come on, she said. I need to eat. He fell into step beside her, and they walked south in the early afternoon, and the city moved around them the same as it always had, indifferent and continuous, and between them something that had no name yet moved too, careful and fragile, and not yet sure of its own weight. The trouble started, as trouble often does, on an ordinary evening. It was 6 weeks later. She was 22 weeks along, visibly pregnant now, the kind of obvious that strangers acknowledged on the subway with glances and offered seats. She had been having a good stretch. The nausea had largely lifted, as Dr. Ewan had said it would, and she was sleeping better. And she had gone back to her freelance work with the transit shelter project and found, to her relief, that her mind was still there, still capable of the spatial thinking and precision that architecture required, still able to hold a full structural problem and turn it. She had met Daniel Ashby for coffee. Daniel was an architect she had known since graduate school. They had studied under the same thesis advisor, overlapped for 2 years, and maintained the easy friendship of people who respect each other's work and have no unresolved history. He was in New York for a project consultation and had texted her 3 days earlier. Heard you're back in the city properly. Coffee? I want to pick your brain about the transit design work. She had said yes without thinking about it, because there was no reason to think about it. They met at a cafe near her apartment on a Thursday afternoon. Daniel was the same as he had always been, tall, slightly disheveled in the way of people whose minds are always partly elsewhere, genuinely interested in her work, funny in a way that made conversation easy without requiring anything from her. They talked for an hour and a half about design methodology and city planning and the transit shelter project and a conference he thought she should submit to in the spring. He congratulated her on the pregnancy with the uncomplicated warmth of an old friend and moved on without belaboring it. She walked home in the late afternoon feeling, for the first time in a long time, like a professional person whose professional life was resuming. She had not told Adrian about the coffee, not because she was hiding it. She told herself this later, and believed it because it was true. She had not told him because she did not think of it as something that required telling. It was coffee with an old colleague. It was the kind of thing that should require no announcement, no context, no explanation. She did not account for the fact that Adrian walked past the cafe. He was there, she found out later, for a meeting at a building 2 blocks over. He had been leaving, had been walking south, and he had passed the window of the cafe and looked in, which is the thing people do when walking past cafe windows, because movement and light draw the eye. And he had seen her, sitting across from a man he did not recognize, laughing at something the man had said. She had been laughing, she remembered, because Daniel had said something funny about an elevator pitch he'd given that had gone spectacularly wrong. He did not come in, he walked past. But he called that evening, and the quality of the call was different. She noticed it within the first 30 seconds. A particular compression in his voice, a formality that had not been there in recent weeks. He asked how her day was. She said fine. He asked if she'd gone out. She said yes, she'd met an old colleague for coffee. A pause. Who? And there it was. She felt it land in her chest, not anger, not quite, more like recognition. The return of something she had been cautiously allowing herself to believe might be different now. Daniel Ashby, she said. We went to graduate school together. He's an architect. He's in town for a project. I didn't know you were still in touch with him. We're colleagues. We stayed in touch. Another pause. You didn't mention it. I didn't mention it because it wasn't significant. It was coffee, Adrian, an hour and a half with a colleague. I know. Do you? He was quiet. I saw you, he said, through the window. I was walking past. She closed her eyes. Then you saw me having coffee with a colleague. You were laughing. I was having a conversation. Yes, I laughed. Evelyn, stop. She kept her voice flat, because if she let any heat into it, it would become a fight, and she did not have the energy for a fight. Stop right there. Listen to what you're doing. Silence. You saw me through a window with someone you didn't recognize, and now you're calling me and asking why I didn't tell you about it. That's what you're doing. That is the thing you are doing right now. He didn't answer. I told you about the coffee, she said. When you asked how my day was, I told you I met a colleague. And the first thing you asked was who. Not how was it, not what did you talk about, who. And then when I told you, you said you didn't know I was still in touch with him, which is not a neutral statement, Adrian. It's a question about why you didn't know, which is a question about whether I should have told you, which is the same thing it always was. That's not... He stopped. She could hear him working through his answer. I'm not trying to... I know you're not trying to. I know, but you are. She stopped. She sat down on her couch. She was suddenly exhausted in a way that went deeper than physical. I can't do this, she said. I cannot be back here, in this conversation, with this dynamic. I just cannot. Evelyn, I need you not to call me tonight, she said. I need some time. A long silence. Then, okay. She hung up and sat in her apartment in the gathering dark and felt the particular grief of someone who had hoped for something and has been reminded, gently and thoroughly, that hope is not the same as change. She turned off the lamp. She sat in the dark for a while. She thought about the ultrasound image on her refrigerator, the profile, the curled fist, and she thought about Daniel Ashby saying he's going to be a handful. Look at that, when she showed it to him, and laughing, and how simple that had been. She thought about the fact that she was 22 weeks pregnant and legally divorced and living alone, and the person who was supposed to be figuring out how to be different had looked in a cafe window and managed, in one phone call, to be exactly the same. She did not call Adrian back. In the morning, she called Nina. He did the thing, she said when Nina picked up. Nina didn't ask which thing. Okay, she said. Come over. Evelyn got her coat. Nina lived in a third-floor walk-up in Carroll Hill that smelled permanently of clay and linseed oil, and on good days, whatever she was testing in the small convection oven she used for glaze experiments. Evelyn had spent more time in this apartment over the past 8 months than she had in the previous 4 years combined, which told her something about what the marriage had done to the geography of her life. She sat on Nina's couch, a large, low thing covered in a Turkish blanket that had seen better decades, and held a cup of tea she hadn't asked for but accepted, and told Nina the phone call in full. Nina listened the way she always listened, without filling the silences or rushing toward the conclusion. When Evelyn finished, Nina turned her mug in her hands and looked at the middle distance for a moment. What did you feel when you hung up? Nina asked. Tired, Evelyn said. Just tired. Not angry? I was angry for about 4 minutes. Then the anger ran out, and there was just tired underneath it. That's worse than angry, Nina said. I know. They sat with that for a moment. Outside Nina's window, a garbage truck was working its way down the block. The sound of it, Hydraulic, mechanical, ordinary. Filled the silence and then faded. The thing that kills me, Evelyn said, is that I was prepared. I went in knowing who he is. I knew that rebuilding trust was supposed to take time and that he wasn't going to be different overnight. I told myself all of that. She stopped. And then he looked through a window and made one phone call, and I felt like I was right back in the apartment on Park Avenue, running through the list of things I hadn't told him fast enough. "You're not back there," Nina said. "I know. Your name is Carter. You live 6 blocks from here. He cannot get into your apartment." "I know that, Nina. I'm just saying it out loud because sometimes it helps to hear it said out loud." Evelyn looked at her tea. It was chamomile. Nina always gave her chamomile in situations like this, on the theory that anything with caffeine would make the feelings louder. "What do I do?" she asked. "What do you want to do?" "I want to know if it's possible for a person to actually change, or if we just keep performing change until the circumstances get difficult enough to show us who we still are." Nina was quiet for a moment. "That's a real question." "I know it's a real question. I'm asking you." "I don't know," Nina said. "I think some things change and some things don't. I think the question of which is the one you're actually trying to answer." Evelyn leaned her head back against the couch. She was 22 weeks pregnant, and it had begun, in the past few weeks, to be physically apparent in a way that changed how she inhabited her own body. A shift in her center of gravity, a heaviness in the evenings, a persistent awareness of the small weight moving inside her that was sometimes wonder and sometimes terror and sometimes just fact. She pressed her palm flat against the side of her stomach, which she did now without thinking, the way you reach for a lamp switch in a dark room you've memorized. "He felt something when he saw that ultrasound," she said. "I know he did. It wasn't performed. I've watched Adrian perform emotion for 7 years, and I know the difference." "I believe you. But feeling something and being someone different are not the same thing." "No," Nina agreed. "They're not." Evelyn closed her eyes. The baby moved. A flutter, low and unmistakable, which she had learned to recognize in the past 3 weeks as distinct from everything else her body did. She stayed still for a moment, feeling it. "I'm not going back to him," she said. It wasn't a decision so much as a statement of something she'd already known. That's not what I'm debating. I'm trying to figure out what 23 more weeks of this looks like, what the next year looks like, what it means to raise a child with someone you love and are afraid of and cannot fully trust." Nina looked at her. "You said love." "I know I said love." She opened her eyes. "That's always been the problem." Whooped. She didn't call Adrian for 4 days. He didn't call her either. She noticed that the absence of the calls, which in past weeks had come reliably on Tuesday, Thursday, Sunday. Tuesday passed with nothing, Thursday the same. She didn't know if the silence meant he was exercising restraint or if it meant something had shifted, and she found that she couldn't tell from the inside which she preferred. On the 5th day, she texted him, "I have a checkup on Monday." 10 a.m., Dr. Ewan's office. "You don't have to come," he replied 4 minutes later. "I'll be there." She put her phone face down and went back to work. The appointment was a routine one: blood pressure, weight, fundal height, the 24-week blood work panel. Dr. Ewan moved through it with her usual efficient warmth, asked about sleep and symptoms and whether the heartburn had started yet, and Evelyn answered in the clipped, competent way she managed medical appointments when she wanted to feel in control of something. Adrian was in the waiting room again when she came out. He stood when he saw her. They walked out together. On the sidewalk, he stopped. She stopped beside him. "I owe you an apology," he said. She waited. "What I did? The phone call. I know what it was. I'm not going to dress it up or explain it in a way that's supposed to make you understand why it was reasonable, because it wasn't. I looked through a window and I didn't like what I felt. And instead of sitting with that feeling alone, I brought it to you. I made it your problem." He paused. "That was wrong." She looked at him. He was not asking her to say anything. He was not waiting for absolution. He had the look of someone who had spent 4 days with something they wished they could put down and had accepted that they couldn't. "Thank you," she said. I'm not asking you to move past it. I'm just saying I know. I hear you. He nodded. They started walking, not together with intention, just both of them moving south because that was the direction of the subway. The morning had the clean, sharp quality of early June. The sky a high blue. The heat not yet arrived. The trees on the block just past full green. After half a block, she said, "You need to talk to someone." "I know." "Not me. A professional. You need to actually understand what the pattern is, and you can't get there on your own because you've been inside it too long." "I've been thinking about that," he said. Since he stopped. "Since the coffee. Since I heard myself on that phone call. I've been going back over it and trying to understand where it comes from, the impulse, and I keep hitting the same wall." A pause. "I don't like what's on the other side of the wall." "That's usually how you know the wall needs to come down," she said. He didn't respond. They reached the corner and the light was red and they stopped. Around them the city churned in its morning rhythm. A bus, a cyclist cursing at a cab, a woman with a stroller navigating the gap between a construction barrier and a parked car. "His name is Marcus Webb," Adrian said. "He came recommended by someone I trust. I have an appointment on Wednesday." She looked at him. "Already?" "I made it Thursday, after the calls I didn't make." She didn't say anything for a moment. The light changed. They crossed. "Good," she said when they reached the other side. "That's good, Adrian." He looked straight ahead. "It doesn't fix anything." "No, but it's a start." They walked another half block without speaking. Then she said, "I'm not running from this. The co-parenting. I want to be clear about that. Even when I need space, I'm here. He's yours too." "I know that." He stopped walking. She stopped too. "Thank you," he said. His voice was different, something compressed underneath it, held back with visible effort. "I know you didn't have to, but I didn't have to do any of this gracefully," she said. "But I'm trying, and I need you to try too, not just the therapy. I need you to try the whole thing. The sitting with discomfort, the not asking who, the letting me have an afternoon without it being information you need." "I know. I need you to actually know it, not just say it." He looked at her. "I know," he said again. And this time it was different, quieter, more careful, the word carrying its own weight. "I'm going to try, and I'm going to fail sometimes. And when I fail, I'm not going to make it your problem. That's what I can offer right now." She studied his face. He was not performing. She was certain of that. What she was less certain of was whether honesty and effort were sufficient foundations for what they were trying to build. And she understood that the answer to that question was not something either of them could know in a parking lot outside a medical building on a Monday in June. It was only something time would answer. "Okay," she said. "That's enough for now." They parted at the subway entrance. She went down the stairs and he stood on the sidewalk above, and she did not look back, but she was aware of him standing there as she descended, the way you are aware of the shape of things you're leaving. The weeks that followed had a particular quality, careful, tentative, like walking on something that might hold and might not. Adrian went to Marcus Webb on Wednesday, and the Wednesday after that. He did not report to Evelyn what they discussed, which was correct. She had not asked and would not have wanted the accounting, but she noticed in their peripheral contact small differences that were hard to articulate. He asked fewer questions. He volunteered information about himself instead of drawing it out of her. When she mentioned an evening with Nina, he said something ordinary like "that sounds good," and moved on. Small things, the kind that could mean everything or nothing depending on how long they held. Her body was its own project during those weeks. The third trimester announced itself with the authority of something that had been patient long enough. She was large in a way that changed the spatial logistics of ordinary life. Turning in bed required strategy. Tying her shoes was a problem she solved by switching to slip-ons. The lower half of her back registered a protest by Thursday of every week that she spent the weekend managing. Dr. Ewan had said, "Everything is progressing well," which was what Evelyn held on to on the evenings when nothing about this felt well. She was working. The transit shelter project had expanded. The firm that commissioned her had liked the first phase enough to bring her on for 3 additional stations. She worked from her apartment in the mornings and came into their office on Thursdays, and the work was good, the specific kind of good that architecture could be when the problem was real and the constraints were honest. She was, in the complicated accounting of her life, more herself than she had been in several years. That remained true even when she was exhausted, even when her back hurt, even when she lay awake at 3 in the morning and thought about the fact that she was going to have a baby, alone, in an apartment with one bedroom, with an ex-husband who was trying to be different and might be, and the jury was still out. She was herself. That counted. Well, she was 31 weeks along when the call came. It was a Sunday evening in August. She had spent the day at home, worked in the morning, taken a long walk in the afternoon that she'd had to cut short because her feet had decided to register a separate protest from her back, eaten dinner at her kitchen counter, called her father in Portland, who had asked careful questions about her health and less careful questions about Adrian, which she had fielded with the particular patience she reserved for her father and nobody else. She had been in bed by 9:30. Not asleep. She rarely slept before 11 anymore, a gestational cruelty. But lying down with a book she was only half reading, one hand resting on the upper curve of her stomach, feeling the intermittent rolling movements that had become the texture of her nights. At 9:47, something changed. She felt it before she understood it, a tightening that was different from the Braxton Hicks contractions Dr. Ewan had explained to her at 28 weeks. Those had been intermittent, irregular, relatively mild. This was a sustained grip, lower and harder, accompanied by a pain that radiated from her lower back around to the front in a wave that took her breath away. She sat up. She waited. She told herself, "It will pass. It's early. It will pass." It passed. Mostly. 4 minutes later, it came back. She sat in her bed and counted. 4 minutes. The second contraction was harder than the first. She felt something else. A wetness, which might have been nothing and which her body told her, with animal certainty, was not nothing. She called Dr. Ewan's emergency line. The on-call physician was a woman named Dr. Park, who listened to Evelyn's description with the focused calm of an emergency specialist and said, "Come in now, don't drive yourself." Evelyn hung up. She sat on the edge of the bed for 10 seconds. Then she did the math on who to call. Nina was in Brooklyn, 40 minutes away on a Sunday night. Her father was in Portland. Margaret Hollis, who had become something approaching a friend through the proceedings, was in Connecticut for the weekend. She called Adrian. It rang 3 times and he picked up, and she could hear from the quality of the background sound that he was home, possibly watching something, the ordinary Sunday evening of a person whose life moved more simply than hers. Evelyn? Just from the way she'd said his name, he already knew. She could hear it, the sharpening, the focus, the shift. "I need you to drive me to the hospital," she said. I might be in early labor. I'm 31 weeks. She heard movement. His keys. A door. "I'm coming," he said. "Don't move. I'll be there in 12 minutes. You can't get here in 14. Stay on the phone." She stayed on the phone. She put him on speaker and moved carefully to her closet and found the bag she had packed 3 weeks ago at Dr. Ewan's suggestion. She had laughed at herself while packing it, told herself she was being anxious. It was too early to worry about that yet. She was grateful now for the version of herself 3 weeks ago who had been anxious. Another contraction. She stopped moving and breathed through it, one hand on the closet door frame. On the phone, she heard Adrian say her name and she said, "I'm okay. It's passing." How far apart? 4 minutes. About 4 minutes. A pause. "Okay, you're doing fine. I'm on the FDR. You're going to get a ticket." "That's fine." She put the bag by the door. She put on shoes. She stood in her entryway and breathed and waited. And at 12 minutes and 40 seconds, she counted, because counting was something to do, her buzzer sounded. He drove fast without being reckless. She was aware of this, aware of him managing the speed and the lights and the turns with a precision that was, in the moment, exactly what the situation required. He had asked her 2 questions when she got in the car. How are you and how far apart are they now? And after she answered both, he had said okay, and driven and not filled the space with anything additional, which was more than she had expected from him in a crisis, and which she filed away. Mount. Sinai West was 22 minutes from her apartment. By the time they pulled up to the emergency entrance, she had had 3 more contractions. Inside, it moved fast. Triage, a wheelchair, a room in the obstetric unit, monitors attached to her abdomen almost immediately. Dr. Park was a compact woman with efficient hands and a manner of speaking in clear, short sentences that Evelyn found deeply steadying. "You're having contractions," Dr. Park said. "We're monitoring the baby's heart rate. How are you feeling besides the pain?" "Scared," Evelyn said, which surprised her. She had not planned to say that. "That's appropriate," Dr. Park said, without softness and without dismissal. "Let's find out what we're dealing with before you spend the energy on scared." Adrian was in the corner of the room. He had stopped at the threshold when they brought her in, and a nurse had looked at him and looked at Evelyn, and Evelyn had said he can stay, and that was that. He was standing near the window, not crowding the medical personnel, not asking questions, not doing the things she had feared he would do in a crisis, not trying to be in charge of something he could not control. He was just present, in the room, available. The next hour was the longest of Evelyn's adult life. Dr. Park's team ran tests. An ultrasound confirmed the baby's position. The contractions continued, irregular but persistent. At 11:15, Dr. Park came in with a face that was professionally neutral and personally very focused, and she stood at the side of the bed and spoke directly to Evelyn. "You have placenta previa with some abruption beginning," she said. "That's the cause of the bleeding. The contractions may be responding to the abruption." "What does that mean for the baby?" Evelyn asked. "Right now, the baby's heart rate is stable, which is reassuring. We're going to give you medication to try to slow the contractions and steroids to help the baby's lung development in case we can't stop the labor. We're going to watch very closely tonight." She paused. "Evelyn, I have to be direct with you. If the abruption progresses significantly, or if the baby shows signs of distress, we may need to proceed to emergency delivery." "He's 31 weeks, Evelyn said. "Yes, 31 weeks is premature. It carries risks. But babies born at 31 weeks with immediate specialized care have good survival rates and good outcomes. Our NICU team is excellent, but I want you to understand what we may be managing tonight." Evelyn looked at the ceiling. She felt the monitor on her stomach, the blood pressure cuff, the IV in her arm. She felt the particular cold clarity that settles in when the body understands that panic is not available as an option. "Okay," she said. "What do you need from me?" "Rest. Don't move unless you have to. Let the medication work. Talk to me if anything changes in how you feel." Dr. Park left. A nurse adjusted the medication drip. The room settled into a different kind of quiet, the monitored, alert quiet of a medical vigil. Adrian crossed the room and pulled a chair to the side of her bed. He sat down. He didn't say anything. She looked at him. His face was... She had never seen his face like this, stripped of everything. No composure, no performance, no controlled surface managing what was underneath. He looked afraid in the way that people look afraid when the fear is too large for the body to contain it quietly. "I'm going to be okay," she said. He looked at her. "You don't know that." "No, but it's what I'm deciding." He exhaled. He put his elbows on the rail of the bed and pressed his hands against his face for a moment, a gesture so unguarded that she looked away to give him the privacy of it. "Adrian," she waited until he lowered his hands. "I need you to be calm, not performed calm, real calm. Can you do that?" He looked at her for a moment. Then he nodded slowly, like he was making a genuine promise and understood its weight. "Good," she said. "Then sit here and be calm with me." He sat. The monitors beeped in their slow rhythm. The medication drip ran. Outside the room, the hospital did its midnight business. At 12:40, the contractions slowed. At 1:15, Doctor. Park returned and reviewed the monitors and said, "Better. The medication is working. Baby's heart rate is good." She looked at Evelyn with the expression of someone choosing words carefully. "We're not out of the woods. I want you here for at least 48 hours of monitoring, but this is a better picture than an hour ago." "Thank you," Evelyn said. "Try to sleep." Dr. Park glanced at Adrian. "Both of you." She left. The quiet returned, softer this time, the specific texture of a crisis that has been stepped back from, but not resolved. Evelyn closed her eyes. She was exhausted in a way that went below ordinary tired, into something cellular and absolute. She lay still and let the monitors tell their slow story and tried to breathe evenly. She heard Adrian's chair shift, heard him settle. After a while, very quietly, he said, "I'm sorry." She didn't open her eyes. For what? For the phone call, for the window, for... He stopped. For all of it, for the years of it. I know an apology is not the right container for what I'm trying to say, but I need you to know that sitting here tonight and not being able to do a single thing, not one thing that actually matters, is the first time I have fully understood what I did to you. A pause. What it feels like. To be in a situation and have no control over the outcome. She lay still. She considered that. That's how I felt, she said. For years. Not about crises. Just Tuesdays. Just ordinary life. I know. His voice was barely above a whisper. I know that now. In my body. Not just in my head where I could argue with it. She opened her eyes. The ceiling was the ordinary ceiling of a hospital room. Acoustic tile, a fluorescent strip turned to its lowest setting, the small red light of a smoke detector in the corner. Marcus Webb, she said. Is he helping? He's making it worse before it helps. Which he said would happen. A pause. He asked me why I needed to know where everyone was. What I was afraid would happen if I didn't, and I gave him all the practical answers, and he waded through all of them, and then he asked what I was actually afraid of. A pause. That was a harder conversation. What did you say? Quiet for a moment. I said I was afraid that if I wasn't watching, things would leave. People would leave. He paused. That they already wanted to, and I was the only thing keeping it from happening. She was still. She listened. He asked me where that started, and I started talking about the company, about business, about accountability and performance, and he let me do that for about 5 minutes. And then he said very calmly that he didn't think we were talking about the company anymore. Another pause. We weren't. She turned her head toward him. He was looking at the monitors, not at her, which made it easier for him to say what he was saying. She understood. Your mother, she said. It wasn't a question. She had known it, in the way that you know the shape of a thing without having its name, for years. He looked at her. Something moved across his face and was absorbed. Yeah, he said, just that. She had never met Adrian's mother, who had died 2 years before they met. A long illness, the details of which Adrian had conveyed in the flat, efficient way he discussed things that cost him. She had known, in a general sense, that the relationship had been complicated. She had not known, because he had never told her, the specifics of what complicated meant. She had not pushed, because Adrian did not respond well to pushing. And somewhere in those years she had stopped pushing on most things. You should have told me that, she said. I know. Not to excuse it, but I should have known what I was dealing with. I know, he said again. I didn't have the language for it. I'm not sure I understood it was a thing I was dealing with until someone made me look at it directly. She looked at him in the low light, at the man who had sat across from her in a law office 4 months ago and watched her sign papers with an expression she couldn't read. At the man who had appeared at her hospital bedside that same evening and said, I want to be involved with a simplicity that she had not been able to dismiss, no matter how much a part of her had wanted to. At the man who had, tonight, driven 14 minutes in 12 and stood in the corner of this room and not tried to take charge of a single thing that wasn't his to take. She was not ready to call that enough. She wasn't ready to call it anything. She was 31 weeks pregnant, in a hospital bed with a monitoring device measuring her son's heartbeat. And the next 24 hours were what they were. And the future was not a place she had the bandwidth to examine tonight. But she looked at him. She let herself look at him. Go get a coffee, she said. From the machine in the hall. Bring me a water. He stood. You should be sleeping. I'll sleep when you get back. Go. He went. She heard his footsteps in the corridor, steady and receding. She turned her head toward the monitor and watched the line trace its rhythm. The baby's heartbeat, steady, persistent. 31 weeks old, and already working hard at the business of being alive. She put her hand on her stomach. She felt a small movement in return, or thought she did, the baby responding to the pressure, or just moving on his own schedule, indifferent to the drama of the evening. Hang on, she said very quietly. Just hang on. The monitor beeped. The hospital breathed around her. Down the hall, she heard the sound of a vending machine dispensing something. When Adrian came back, she was still awake. He handed her the water and sat back down in the chair beside her bed, and he held his coffee in both hands and looked at the monitors, and she looked at the ceiling. "Tell me about your mother," she said. He looked at her. "Not all of it," she said. "Just something. Something true." He was quiet for a long moment. Then he began to speak, and his voice was low and careful. And she closed her eyes and listened, and the monitors kept their steady count, and the night moved around them in the way nights in hospitals move, slowly, attended with all the weight of what is being watched over. 48 hours later, she was discharged. The contractions had not returned. The abruption had not progressed. Dr. Yuen, who took over her care at Monday morning rounds, had been precise and unsentimental. This can happen again. You need to reduce physical stress significantly. You need to be seen twice weekly from here on out. And you need someone with you who can get you here quickly if it does. She had looked at Adrian, who was in the chair that had become, over 48 hours, the chair where he lived. He had barely left the room except for coffee and the brief, humiliating hygiene trips that hospitals made necessary. He had met her eyes. He hadn't said anything. He didn't have to. On the drive home, she sat in the passenger seat with her hands in her lap and watched the city go past. It was Tuesday morning, late summer, the city loud and hot, and completely indifferent to the fact that she had spent 2 days inside a version of her life she had not previously been able to imagine. "You should stay," she said. She said it to the window, not to him. He didn't answer immediately. "At your place," she said. "Your apartment's 20 minutes from mine. You can—" Dr. Yuen said someone needs to be reachable. You were reachable. 12 minutes, apparently, even with traffic. 14, he said. "Right." She paused. "I'm not asking you to move back in. I'm not asking for anything to change. I'm asking you to be available, geographically." "I've been in my apartment," he said quietly. "I never went anywhere." She looked at him. He was watching the road. "I know," she said. "I know you didn't." She turned back to the window. The FDR moved below them, the river flat and gray beside it. The city assembled itself around them in its ordinary way, enormous and unconcerned. She was going home. The baby was still where he was supposed to be. The next 9 weeks were unwritten. She put her hand against the window, feeling the city's warmth through the glass. She thought about a restaurant in Rome with paper placemats, and a man who asked questions and actually listened to the answers. She thought about 7 years. She thought about a phone call at 9:17 and a window and a coffee shop and 43 pages and a floor. She thought about a chair in the corner of a hospital room, occupied every time she opened her eyes. She did not say any of this out loud. She kept it where it was. But she stopped looking at the window, and she looked at his hands on the wheel instead, and she kept looking for a long time, and he didn't say anything, and neither did she. She didn't ask him to come inside when they got back to her apartment. He pulled up to the curb and put the car in park, and she sat in the passenger seat for a moment with her bag in her lap, not moving, looking at the entrance to her building as though she was making a calculation. He didn't fill the silence. That was new enough that she still noticed it, the way he had learned or was learning to wait. "Thank you," she said, "for the last 2 days. You don't have to thank me for that." "I know I don't have to." She opened the door. "I'm choosing to." She got out slowly, one hand on the door frame, because 31 weeks and 2 days in a hospital bed had made her body feel provisional in a way she didn't like. He was out of his side before she'd straightened up, not rushing to her, not taking her arm without asking, just positioned between her and the traffic, which was the old habit she had noticed before and still said nothing about. "I'll call tonight," he said, "to check in. Okay?" She looked at him. He looked at her. It was one of those moments that existed outside the ordinary pace of things, too brief to be significant and too weighted to be ordinary. Then she turned and walked into her building, and the door closed behind her, and she did not look back. Upstairs, she stood in the center of her apartment and took inventory. It smelled slightly stale from 2 days unoccupied. Her book was still on the bed where she'd left it Sunday evening, face down on the page she'd been half reading. The dinner she hadn't finished was in the refrigerator, covered in plastic wrap, a fact she discovered when she went to get water and stood looking at it for a moment before closing the refrigerator door. She sat on the couch and called Dr. Yuen's office to schedule the twice-weekly monitoring appointments. Then she called Nina, Nina answered on the second ring with, "I'm already in the car." "You don't have to." "I'm already in the car, Evelyn." She arrived 40 minutes later with groceries and the particular focus competence she deployed in emergencies, which was considerable. She did not ask a lot of questions. She put food in the refrigerator and changed the sheets on Evelyn's bed and made dinner. Actual dinner, rice and chicken and something with ginger that filled the apartment with a smell so normal and good that Evelyn felt unexpectedly like crying. She did not cry. She sat at her kitchen counter and ate and let Nina talk about a ceramics commission she was working on, a large installation piece for a hotel lobby in Chicago, the logistics of which were apparently a nightmare in the most satisfying way. She listened and ate and felt the baby move and said very little, and it was exactly what she needed. After dinner, Nina poured herself a glass of wine and looked at Evelyn across the counter. "Tell me about the hospital," Evelyn told her. "The contractions, the drive, the 48 hours of monitoring, Dr. Park and Dr. Ewan. The medication that had worked, the chair in the corner that Adrian had occupied for 2 days without being asked." Nina listened without interrupting. "He told me about his mother," Evelyn said. "At some point around 2 in the morning, just started talking, things he'd never said in 7 years of marriage." "What kind of things?" "The way she left." She looked at her water glass. "Not death. She didn't die when he was young or anything like that. She left when he was 11, walked out, moved across the country. He didn't see her for 3 years." She paused. "He said the worst part wasn't the leaving. It was the period before it, when he could tell something was wrong, but no one would tell him what. He said he spent those months watching her constantly, trying to read her, trying to figure out if today was going to be a good day or a bad one, whether she seemed happy, whether she was still—" She stopped. "Whether she was still planning to stay." Nina was very quiet. "And he just never stopped doing that," Evelyn said. "Moved it on to everyone else, needed to know where people were, needed to read the room, needed all the variables accounted for so he could know, in advance, if something was going to leave." She exhaled. "And I was the person who actually did leave, which is—" She shook her head. "It doesn't excuse it. I want to be clear that I know it doesn't excuse any of it. But sitting in that hospital room at 2 in the morning, it's hard to hate someone when you understand what made them." "You never hated him," Nina said. "No. That was always the problem, wasn't it?" Evelyn looked at her. "Probably." Nina turned her wine glass slowly in her hands. "What do you want, Evelyn? Not what's practical. Not what makes sense for the baby or for the co-parenting or for any of the structures you've built around this situation. What do you actually want?" Evelyn thought about it. She sat with the question honestly, which was harder than it sounded because she had spent a significant amount of the past year not examining it too directly, maintaining a deliberate blur around the center of the thing so she could function around the edges of it. "I want him to be who he was at 2 in the morning in that hospital room," she said, "all the time, not in a crisis, just ordinarily." She paused. "And I don't know if that's possible. And I don't know if the not knowing is something I can live in indefinitely." Nina nodded. She didn't offer an answer because she was wise enough to understand there wasn't one to offer. She refilled her wine and they sat together in the kitchen while the city moved outside the window. And after a while they talked about other things. The remaining weeks of the pregnancy organized themselves around the twice-weekly monitoring appointments, which Evelyn attended with the grim efficiency of someone managing a project with a fixed deadline. Dr. Ewan was satisfied with each visit. Blood pressure within acceptable range, baby's growth tracking well, the abruption stable and not progressing. "You're doing everything right, doctor," Ewan said at 34 weeks, which was the kind of sentence that sounded like praise and functioned more like instruction. Adrian drove her to every appointment. This had not been explicitly negotiated. After the hospital, she had said geographically available, and he had understood that to mean the appointments too, and she had not corrected the interpretation. He drove and waited and drove her home. And sometimes she told him how the appointment went, and sometimes she handed him the printed monitoring strip and let him read it himself. And those handoffs, paper to hand, numbers explained, the small logistics of shared concern, became their language for the weeks that followed. He was in his own apartment, which was 22 minutes away in light traffic and 14 minutes at 11 on a Sunday night. She had the number in her phone. She had used it once, and it had worked. She did not think too far ahead. This was a discipline she had never been naturally good at. She was a planner, an architect, someone who lived in the logic of what came next. But she had learned, over the past months, that the future was not a safe place to spend too much time. The future contained things she could not yet answer for. The present had appointments and monitoring strips and ginger tea and Nina's Tuesday check-in calls and the transit shelter project, which she had continued working on from home with the quiet, focused pleasure of someone who needs at least one thing to be uncomplicated. The present was enough. She stayed in it. Leo Vaughn arrived at 38 weeks and 2 days, which was not premature, not a crisis, not the emergency they had both quietly been bracing for since August. He arrived on a Thursday afternoon in October, which struck Evelyn, in the blurred aftermath, as improbably apt. October was the month she had met his father in a restaurant in Rome, and if she were a different kind of person, she might have found that meaningful, but she was herself, so she filed it away and moved on. The labor was long and not gentle, and not the kind of experience that lends itself to the words people used about it afterward. Incredible, amazing, transformative, which were accurate in some clinical sense but missed the central fact, which was that it was the hardest physical thing she had ever done, and she would not be repeating it with any enthusiasm. She said as much to Dr. Yuen at some point during hour 11, and Dr. Yuen had said, without looking up, "You can tell me that again in a year," which was not the empathy Evelyn was looking for, but was probably honest. Adrian was there. She had told him, 6 weeks earlier, that she wanted him in the room, and she had said it with the flatness of someone stating a logistical preference rather than making an emotional gesture, which was the only way she could say it without overcomplicating it. He had said okay in the same register. They were good, sometimes, at matching each other's register. He was not what she expected in the delivery room. She had expected him to try to manage the situation, to ask the nurses questions, to reference things he had read, to have an opinion about the fetal monitor placement. He did none of that. He stood where he was told to stand and sat when there was waiting and held her hand when she needed it, held and did not speak unless she spoke first. And when she said at hour 9 that she needed him to stop looking at her so intently because she felt like a situation he was trying to solve, he said, "Okay," and looked at the wall, and she almost laughed, which she had not expected to do. Leo arrived at 4:47 in the afternoon, and the sound he made was the most immediate thing Evelyn had ever experienced. More present than pain, more present than exhaustion, more present than anything. Small and furious, and entirely himself. The nurse put him on her chest. She felt the weight of him, specific and real, and she looked at his face, red and compressed and ferociously unhappy about the transition he had just been required to make. And something in her rearranged itself in a way that was permanent and non-negotiable. She looked up. Adrian was standing at her shoulder, looking at Leo, and his face was... She looked at his face and understood something she hadn't had language for before. Not tenderness exactly, though that was there. Not awe, though that was there too. It was the face of someone encountering something they have no existing category for, something that doesn't fit inside any of the structures they have built to organize their experience of the world. He reached out one hand, very slowly, and touched Leo's head, just the tips of his fingers, barely making contact, as though afraid of disturbing something fragile. "Hey," he said, very quietly. "To the baby." Just that. Evelyn looked down at Leo. She felt Adrian's hand brush her shoulder as he pulled it back. She did not say anything. There was nothing adequate to say. The first weeks at home were the kind of education no book fully prepares you for, because no book can adequately convey the specific texture of sustained sleep deprivation in combination with profound love, in combination with a body that is recovering from something enormous. Evelyn had the one-bedroom apartment which she had spent the last 2 months converting, a crib in the corner of her room, a changing table where her reading chair had been, blackout curtains that Nina had helped her hang one Sunday afternoon while Adrian was in his apartment 22 minutes away reading, she later learned, 3 different books about infant development simultaneously. He came every day. She had not asked for that. It had started as every other day, which had seemed reasonable, And then and every other day became the day in between when she had texted him a photo of Leo at 2 in the morning because she was awake anyway, and Leo had done something with his face that she needed another person to witness. And he had called back in 30 seconds, "Is everything okay?" And she had said, "Yes, he just looks like a little old man when he sleeps. Look at him." And Adrian had looked at the photo for a long moment before saying, "He really does," in a voice that sounded like someone trying not to wake something up inside themselves. After that, he came every day. He came in the morning and he held Leo while she showered, which was a transaction of pure practical value that she did not attach additional meaning to or tried not to. He came in the afternoon sometimes and sat in the kitchen while she slept, which she did when Leo slept, in the aggressive and guilt-free way that Dr. Yuen had prescribed. He brought food, not elaborate food, not performances of consideration, but real food, the kind that could be eaten with one hand at 4 in the morning, sandwiches, soup, the good crackers from the place on 9th that she had mentioned once in passing months ago. He did not tell her what to do. He did not suggest she was doing things wrong. He did not hold Leo in a way that implied he thought she was holding Leo incorrectly, which she had been told by Nina, who had been told by her sister, was a thing that could happen and was maddening. He asked. He waited for answers. He acted on what she said, not on what he thought she should have said. She noticed every instance of this. She could not help noticing. After 7 years of the alternative, noticing its absence felt like pressing on a bruise to see if it still hurt, and most days it did hurt, but in a different way than before. Not the deep ache of something ongoing, but the surface tenderness of something healing. She was aware of the difference. She was not yet sure what to do with it. Leo was 6 weeks old when she first clearly saw the man that Adrian was trying to become. It was a Saturday. He had come at 9 in the morning and taken Leo so she could sleep, and she had slept until noon, which was extravagant and necessary. And when she came out of the bedroom, he was sitting in the armchair she'd moved from the living room to the corner near the window, with Leo against his chest, and he was talking. He didn't hear her come out. He was looking at Leo and talking in the low, even voice that adults use with babies, not because they think the babies understand the words, but because the words are a way of being present, a way of saying, "I am here, you are here, and I am paying attention." He was telling Leo about the building he could see from the window, describing it, brick by brick, explaining how buildings were put together, what made the arch above a window structural or decorative. His voice was patient and specific. He was teaching a 6-week-old about load-bearing walls. She stood in the doorway and watched him. He was not performing this. She understood that immediately, with the certainty she had learned to trust in herself over the past year. There was no audience for it. He thought she was asleep. This was just who he was in a room with his son when no one was watching. She went to the kitchen and made coffee and stood at the counter for a while before she went back. Later that afternoon, after Adrian had gone home and Leo was asleep, and she was sitting on the couch with the particular blank tiredness of a new mother, she thought about the armchair. She thought about load-bearing walls. She called Nina. "I watched him talking to Leo this morning," she said. "He didn't know I was there." "What was he saying?" "Architecture. He was describing the building across the street." Nina was quiet for a moment. "How did you feel?" "Like something shifted," she said. "Not dramatically, just I felt something move." "Moved how?" She thought about it. "You know when you've been carrying something for a long time and you put it down, and your arms are still shaped like the thing you were carrying, even though it's gone?" She paused. "Less like that. More like my arms started remembering what they feel like without it." Nina was quiet again, longer this time. "Evelyn, I'm not making a decision. I'm just describing a feeling." "I know. I'm not saying make a decision. I'm just—" A pause. "I'm glad you called me." "Who else would I call?" "Exactly," Nina said. At 8 weeks, Leo had his first pediatric appointment. The pediatrician was a woman named Dr. Sandra Cho, who had a practice on the Upper West Side, and who had been recommended by 3 separate people whose judgment Evelyn trusted. Dr. Cho examined Leo with the efficient thoroughness of someone who takes small humans seriously, measured and weighed and assessed with a running commentary that included Leo in the conversation the way some doctors included conscious adult patients, which Evelyn found immediately correct. "He's doing beautifully," Dr. Cho said, settling back. "Good weight gain, good muscle tone, tracking normally for adjusted age." She looked at Evelyn. "How are you doing? And I mean you, not the baby." "Tired," Evelyn said. "Functional." "Are you eating?" "Yes." "Sleeping when you can?" "When I have help." Dr. Cho looked at Adrian, who was in the chair beside Evelyn. "Is that you?" "Yes," he said. "Good." Dr. Cho clicked her pen. "The first 3 months are about survival. For everyone. Don't make major decisions. Don't make permanent assessments of your situation. Just get through it and reassess on the other side." She looked at Evelyn. "Both of you." In the elevator going down, Evelyn said, "She was talking to us like we're together." "I know," Adrian said. "We're not." "I know." She pressed the lobby button. The elevator descended. "I'm not saying it to put distance between us," she said. "I'm saying it because I think it's important to keep saying it, so we both know what this is." "What is it?" he asked. She looked at him. He was watching the floor numbers descend. His profile was familiar in the way that things you have looked at for years are familiar. The line of his jaw, the slight furrow he got when he was thinking carefully. "I don't know yet," she said honestly. He nodded. "Okay. Does that bother you?" "Yes," he said, "but not enough to push you for an answer you don't have." She looked at him for a moment. The elevator reached the lobby and the doors opened and the cool air of the building's entrance came in. She didn't move immediately. "That's new," she said. "I know," he said. "I'm working on making it permanent." She stepped out of the elevator. He followed. They walked out into the October afternoon, which was the same October she'd met him in years ago, in a city on the other side of the ocean, though she did not say this and was not sure whether he was thinking it too. The shape of their days settled into a pattern that was not a relationship and was not a relationship and was, she supposed, its own thing. A thing they had made out of necessity and crisis, and 2 days in a hospital room, and a chair in a corner, and which had its own structure even without a name. He came in the mornings on weekdays. On weekends he came at noon, which gave her the morning hours she'd identified as her most productive and which she reclaimed for work in 2-hour blocks while Leo napped. The transit shelter project was nearing completion. She had submitted the final design for the 3rd station and received, in return, a commission request for a 4th, which she had stared at for a long moment before accepting, because it meant she was still capable of being the person she'd been trying to become in the years before everything divided into before and after. She had dinner with Nina on Wednesday evenings, which had become fixed since the hospital, and which neither of them had felt the need to discuss or formalize. Adrian stayed with Leo until she got back, which was usually 9 or 9:30. He was always gone by the time she came home, the apartment tidier than she'd left it, Leo asleep, the dishes in the rack drying. She noticed that too. The dishes. One Wednesday in November, she came home at 9:15 and found him still there. He was standing at her kitchen counter with a cup of coffee, and he looked up when she came in, and she could tell by his expression that he had meant to leave before she got back and had lost track of time. "Leo woke up at 8:30, he said. "I just got him back down." "Is he okay?" "Fine. Just awake. We had a conversation about it." He almost smiled. He made compelling points for why 8:30 was a reasonable time to be awake. I disagreed. Eventually, he accepted my position. She put her bag down by the door. She was still in her coat. The apartment was warm, which he had done. Turned the heat up without being asked, which she would have found intrusive 9 months ago, and now just felt like someone paying attention to the room temperature. "You can sit down," she said. "You don't have to leave this second." He looked at her, like he was checking whether that was what she actually meant or courtesy. "I mean it," she said. "Sit down." He sat. She hung up her coat and poured herself a glass of water and sat on the other end of the couch. Not far, not performing distance, just where she happened to sit. Leo's monitor was on the coffee table between them, its small green light blinking in its steady rhythm. "How's Marcus Webb?" she asked. "He asks uncomfortable questions," Adrian said, "and then sits there looking like he has nowhere else to be while you figure out how to answer them. Is that good?" "Apparently." He turned his coffee mug in his hands. "We spent 3 sessions on the phone call, the one about Daniel Ashby. Going back over what I was feeling, where it came from, what I did with it, instead of what I could have done. He paused. It's a slow process. Most real things are. He looked at her. He asked me what I want, not what I think I should want, not what's realistic given the situation, what I want. He paused. I told him. She waited. He said to tell you when I was ready. A pause. I've been trying to figure out when that is. She felt the particular stillness of a moment that is about to change its shape. She was aware of the green light on the monitor, the hum of the city outside, the coffee cup in his hands. Adrian, she said. I want to be with you, he said. Simple and direct, with none of the performance she might have expected, no framing or preamble. I'm not asking for that now. I know there's a long distance between wanting it and it being right. But you asked me to be honest, and I'm being honest. He paused. I want to be in the room. Not just in the morning on weekdays and weekends at noon. I want to be in the room. She looked at him, at the cup in his hands, at the small, careful way he was holding himself. Not suppressed, not performed, just genuinely trying not to lean toward her any more than the truth required. I know you're not asking for an answer, she said. I'm not. Good. She looked at the monitor, the green light. Because I don't have one. I have... She stopped. I have something. I don't know what to call it yet. He nodded once, slowly. The dishes, she said. He looked at her. What? Every night you're here with Leo, you do the dishes, you put them in the rack. She paused. You don't do them in a way that means I should notice. You just do them. He was quiet. That's the difference, she said. She stopped again, because she didn't know how to finish the sentence exactly, but she could feel its shape. That's the thing that I'm watching, not the big gestures, not what you say when you're trying to convince me of something. The dishes, the heat, the way you sat in the corner of that hospital room and didn't touch a single thing that wasn't yours to touch. She looked at him. That's the version of you I didn't know existed, the one that was underneath all the control. He was very still. I'm watching it, she said. I'm not looking away. I just need more time with it, before I know what it means. He exhaled. It was a very quiet exhale, the kind that carries a lot of weight. Okay, he said. Okay? Yes. Okay. He looked at the monitor. I can wait. She looked at him. At the man who had been, in her experience, constitutionally unable to wait for things, who had organized his entire life around eliminating the experience of not knowing, of uncertainty, of the gap between wanting and having, who had driven to her apartment with a scarf and stood in her doorway in February rain because waiting was the one thing he could not do. Sitting on her couch at 9:30 on a Wednesday in November, he looked like a man who was learning. It was not everything. She did not pretend it was everything, but it was real, and she was watching it, and that was more than she had been willing to offer in a very long time. Go home, she said. Drive carefully. He stood. He put the coffee mug in the kitchen. She heard the small sound of it placed on the counter, and then the sound of him putting it in the dish rack, because he was who he was and the dishes were there. And he got his coat. At the door he paused. Thank you, he said, for tonight. Oh, you did the hard part, she said. I just sat here. He looked at her for a moment with the expression she was beginning to recognize. The open, unperformed one. The one she'd seen at the 16-week ultrasound and in the hospital room and in the armchair across from a window, teaching a 6-week-old about load-bearing walls. Then he left. The door closed. She heard his footsteps in the hallway, the elevator, and then nothing. She sat on the couch in the quiet apartment. The monitor blinked green. She could hear very faintly Leo breathing through the audio function, the small, steady sound of him asleep, whole and present and doing the work of being alive. She looked at the dishes in the rack. She stayed with that for a while. Then she got up, turned off the kitchen light, and went to check on her son. December came in cold and without ceremony, the way New York winters always did, not gradually but suddenly, as though the city had simply decided overnight that it was done with autumn and everyone would now adjust. The trees on Evelyn's block went bare in the space of a week. The heating in her building made the particular sound it made when it was working hard, a low clanking in the pipes that she had learned to sleep through and that Leo apparently found soothing because he slept better in December than he had in the warmer months when the building was quiet. He was 10 weeks old. He had begun, in the past 2 weeks, to look at things with genuine interest, tracking movement, following faces, fixing his gaze on the overhead light in the kitchen with the focused intensity of someone encountering electricity for the first time. He had also begun to smile, which Dr. Cho said was the social smile developing on schedule, and which Evelyn experienced not as a developmental milestone, but as the single most destabilizing thing that had happened to her in a year that had contained an extraordinary number of destabilizing things. He smiled at the ceiling fan. He smiled at Nina. He smiled at Adrian with a consistency and enthusiasm that Adrian received each time with an expression that Evelyn had stopped trying to look away from. She had stopped looking away from a lot of things. The Wednesday dinners with Nina continued. The twice-weekly monitoring appointments had ended at Leo's 6-week checkup, replaced by the ordinary schedule of a healthy infant, monthly pediatric visits, the gradual normalization of a life that had been, for the better part of a year, organized around the next medical appointment. Without the appointments anchoring her calendar, she noticed the space they left, and what moved into that space was the thing she had been putting at the edges of her awareness for weeks, careful not to look at it directly. She was looking at it now. It happened as the significant things in her life had a tendency to do without announcement. It was a Tuesday evening in mid-December, 3 days before a winter storm that the weather services had been describing with increasing urgency for a week. Adrian had come at noon and stayed late. They had fallen into a kind of extended afternoon together, the three of them, in the way that happened sometimes when Leo was in a good mood and the apartment was warm and no one had a particular reason to end it. They had ordered food at 6. They had watched Leo work through the complicated business of recognizing his own hand, which took about 45 minutes and held their combined attention in a way that neither of them commented on, because commenting on it would have required them to say something about the fact that they were watching their son discover his hand together, and neither of them was ready to name what that was. At 8, Leo went down. Adrian did the dishes. She changed into something warmer because the temperature outside had dropped 15 degrees since noon, and when she came back to the living room, he was in the armchair, the one from the corner, which had migrated gradually into the living room over the past weeks in the slow territorial drift of objects that belonged to a space, with his jacket still on, which meant he was preparing to go. She sat on the couch. The monitor blinked green. "Stay," she said. He looked at her. "The storm is supposed to start tonight," she said. "It's 20 degrees outside, and it's going to be worse by 10, and your apartment is 22 minutes away, which, in a storm, is 40. She paused. "The couch is fine. I've slept on it." He studied her. She could see him doing the thing where he checked what was being offered against what it actually meant, because Adrian Vaughn had been surprised before by the distance between the surface of a thing and its interior, and he had learned not to assume. "That's all you're saying," he said. "Not a question. Just making sure." "That's all I'm saying." He looked at the window. Outside, the first tentative snow was beginning. She could see it in the light from the street lamp, thin and provisional, the storm feeling its way. "Okay," he said. She got him a blanket from the closet. He took off his jacket and his shoes and settled on the couch with the efficiency of someone who is not going to make a production of this, and she turned off the living room light and said goodnight and went to bed. She lay in the dark for a while. The building clanked. Leo breathed in his small, even rhythm in the crib across the room. Outside, the wind was picking up. She could hear it, the particular sound of New York in a storm, the way the city absorbed weather and threw it back differently, the wind finding channels between buildings and becoming something louder than itself. She lay there and thought about what she had just done, and whether it was what she thought it was, and what she was going to do about knowing what she thought. She fell asleep before she arrived at an answer. In the morning, Leo woke at 5:45, which was approximately when he always woke, indifferent to weather systems or the question of who was sleeping on the living room couch. She got up and got him before he fully committed to crying, and she was in the kitchen in the low pre-dawn light, heating a bottle and holding him against her shoulder when she heard Adrian move in the living room. He appeared in the kitchen doorway. He had the flattened look of someone who slept on a couch in their clothes, his shirt wrinkled, his hair compressed on one side, the controlled surface of his ordinary appearance entirely absent. He looked like a person, just a tired, rumpled person in a kitchen at 6 in the morning. "Give him to me," he said, his voice rough with sleep. "I'll feed him. You should sleep." She looked at him. He held out his hands, and she looked at his hands, which she had looked at 1,000 times in 1,000 contexts, in Rome and in their apartment on Park Avenue, and in the corner of a law office on 53rd Street, and in a hospital room where he had touched their son's head for the first time and said, "Hey," in a voice that barely made sound. She handed him the baby. He took Leo against his shoulder, and she handed him the bottle, and he looked down at his son with the expression she had seen in the armchair, the one that had no performance in it. And she stood in her kitchen and watched the man she had divorced feeding their child at 6 in the morning after sleeping on her couch in the middle of a snowstorm, and something inside her that had been very carefully in transit arrived at its destination. She didn't say anything yet. She went back to bed. She slept for 2 hours, which was the kind of sleep that only happened when you trusted the person on the other side of the wall. And she lay very still when she woke up and acknowledged what she had just understood about herself. She told Nina on Wednesday, "I know what it is," she said, "the thing I couldn't name." They were at the usual table, the coffee shop on Bleecker, Nina with her latte and Evelyn with the decaf that she still found mildly insulting but had accepted as her life. Outside, the storm from Tuesday had left 4 inches of gray-white snow that the city was in the process of converting to slush, because that was what New York did with beautiful things that disrupted traffic. "Tell me," Nina said. "I still love him," Evelyn said. "I never stopped. That was never the question." She wrapped both hands around her cup. "The question was whether loving him was safe, whether I could love him without losing myself inside it." She paused. "And I don't think I have the final answer to that. I don't think you get a final answer to that in advance. I think you just—" She stopped. "I think you have to decide if the person is worth the risk of the not knowing." Nina looked at her steadily. "And he did the dishes," Evelyn said, "for months, when no one was watching, and he sat in a corner and didn't touch anything that wasn't his. And he learned something about himself that was hard to learn, and he learned it because I left and not before, which is terrible and true." She paused. "And I watched him at 6 in the morning looking at Leo, and I thought, that's who he is underneath all the rest of it. That's the person who was in there the whole time, underneath the control, underneath the fear." She looked at Nina. "I don't know if I'm wrong." "You might be," Nina said. "I know. He might revert, under pressure, under ordinary life. It's easy to be good in a crisis." "I know that too. So what are you going to do?" Evelyn looked at her coffee, at the table, at the small round window in the wall of the coffee shop that looked onto the street, where a woman was pushing a stroller through the slush with the particular focused determination of someone who has stopped being surprised by difficulty and has simply integrated it. "I'm going to tell him the truth," she said, "and then we're going to figure it out like adults. Imperfectly, probably messily." She paused. "But honestly," Nina was quiet for a moment, then she said, "I want you to be happy." "I know you do. I also want you to be careful. Those two things are not mutually exclusive." "No," Nina said. "They're not." She picked up her latte. "When?" "Soon," Evelyn said. "Before I talk myself out of it." She chose a Sunday because Sundays had become the day with the most room in them. Adrian came at noon, and there was no schedule pressing on either end, no appointment or evening plan imposing a shape. Leo was 3 months old and had settled somewhat into the organized unpredictability of an infant who knew the difference between day and night and mostly respected it. He arrived at noon with the good soup from the place on 9th and a small bag of the crackers she liked, which he put on the counter without ceremony because he had stopped performing the gestures and was just making them. They ate at her kitchen counter while Leo slept. She told him about the transit shelter project. The 4th station had been approved, and she had begun the design phase, which she was enjoying in the specific way she enjoyed the beginning of things, when the problem was still fully open and the solution hadn't narrowed yet. He talked about the company, which she had not asked him about in a long time, not because she wasn't interested, but because asking about it had once meant entering a landscape where she wasn't sure of her footing. He talked about it now the way people talk about their work when they are not performing it, with frustration about a logistics problem that had taken 2 weeks to resolve, with genuine pleasure about an acquisition that had gone better than expected, with the ordinary mixed texture of a professional life. She listened. She asked a question. He answered and asked one back. It sounded, she thought, like two people who knew each other talking. After lunch, he did the dishes. She sat at the counter and watched him do them and didn't pretend she wasn't watching. He turned and found her watching and didn't ask what she was thinking because he had learned to give things room. "I need to talk to you," she said. He dried his hands. He turned all the way around and leaned against the counter across from her, and he waited. She had thought about how to say this. She had tried several versions of it in her head and rejected them all because they all sounded like either too much or too careful, and what she wanted was to say the actual thing. "I was wrong about one thing," she said. "When I left, I told myself that loving you wasn't enough to stay, and that was true. The love was there, but the way we were living was wrong, and I couldn't fix it from inside of it. I know that." She paused. "But I told myself that the loving you part was the problem, that if I could just separate it from everything else, set it aside and be practical about the situation, I could get through it without it costing me too much." She stopped. That was not accurate. He was very still. Not his old stillness, not the controlled performance of composure. The stillness of genuine attention. "I didn't separate it," she said. "I just carried it with me the whole time. Every appointment and every phone call and every morning with the dishes, I was watching you with it the whole time and I was pretending I wasn't." He exhaled slowly. He didn't move. "I'm not saying it's simple," she said. "I'm not saying I've forgotten what it felt like in that apartment, those years. I haven't. I'm not going to. And I'm not saying I'm ready to be back inside something that looks like what we had, because I'm not." She paused. "But I think we're different from what we were. I think I'm different, and I think you are too. And I think different people should get the chance to find out what they can make together, if they want to." "I want to," he said, immediately, without strategy. She looked at him. "I know you do. I need you to understand what I'm saying about the pace of it. Tell me." "Slow," she said. "Genuinely slow. Not slow as a performance of patience and then faster once I've given you an inch. Actually slow. We're 3 months out from a hospital emergency and 8 months from a divorce, and I have a 12-week-old, and I am tired in a way that is difficult to overstate." She paused. "I need time not to be the thing we're racing against." "Okay," he said. "I need to be able to say that something is wrong without you defending against it." "Okay. And when you feel the impulse, the window, the questions, the needing to know, I need you to take it to Marcus Webb before you bring it to me." He was quiet for a moment. "That's fair," he said. "That's more than fair." "I'm not constructing a list of conditions," she said. "I'm trying to tell you what I actually need. There's a difference." "I know the difference," he said. And she believed him, which was something she would not have been able to say a year ago, and the fact that she could say it now was information she held carefully. "Okay," she said. So, he said. They looked at each other across the kitchen counter. He was wearing a gray sweater she didn't recognize, which meant he'd bought it in the past year, which meant there were things about him she didn't know, gaps that had opened during the time they'd been apart, new things that would need to be learned. That was terrifying, and also, she found, interesting. "I'm not asking you to move back in," she said. "Not yet. Not for a long time, probably. I understand. But I'm also not asking you to leave at 9 o'clock anymore," she said. "If you don't have to." He looked at her. Something moved across his face that was not the performed calm, and was not the stripped-open fear she'd seen in the hospital, and was not the guarded watching of the early weeks. It was something quieter, more settled, like a man who has been standing at the edge of something for a very long time and has just been told he can stop. "Okay," he said. His voice was careful, not with performance, with the actual care of someone holding something they don't want to drop. From the bedroom, Leo made the small preliminary sounds that meant he was about to be awake. They both heard it. She started to move and Adrian said, "I'll get him," and she stopped. She listened to his footsteps in the hall, the soft creak of the floorboard outside the bedroom door. She knew that creak, had learned it the way you learn the sounds of a space you live in. She heard him go in. She heard his voice, low and specific, saying something to Leo that she couldn't make out. She stood in her kitchen in December, 3 months after her son was born, 9 months after she had signed her name on 43 pages and walked out of a law office and hit the floor. She stood in the kitchen that was hers, the apartment she had chosen, the life she had constructed, piece by deliberate piece, out of the aftermath of something that had cost her tremendously. And she thought about a sentence that Marcus Webb had apparently said to Adrian, which Adrian had reported one evening without being asked. The opposite of control isn't chaos, it's trust. And she thought about whether that was true, and she thought that it was true, and she thought that trust was not a feeling but a practice, not a destination but a decision you made every day, knowing you might be wrong and making it anyway, because the alternative was a life lived at the edges of things, never in the center of them. She was tired of the edges. Leo was fully awake now. She could hear the small declarative sounds of an infant who has opinions about consciousness and wants them known. She heard Adrian say something low and amused in response, which was not the careful tenor of a man performing fatherhood, but the voice of someone genuinely engaged by a person who has 8 pounds of strong feelings and total trust. She heard that and she thought, there it is. That's the thing I couldn't name in the armchair at 6 in the morning in the corner of a hospital room. That's the thing that was there under everything, waiting for both of us to be capable of seeing it. She poured 2 glasses of water and carried them to the living room and set them on the coffee table and sat on the couch and waited. He came in with Leo against his shoulder, and Leo was in the particular state of fresh wakefulness where everything was interesting, looking around the living room with his dark eyes moving from the lamp to the window to the shape of Adrian's face. Adrian sat in the armchair, because, of course, that was where he sat. And she looked at them across the coffee table. He's looking at you, she said. He does this thing, Adrian said, where he makes eye contact and just holds it, like he's deciding something. He's deciding constantly, she said. Everything is a decision for him right now. Who to trust, what's safe, where it's okay to put his attention. Adrian looked at her. She looked back. He seems to have come down on a position, she said. Adrian looked down at Leo, who was still watching his face with the focused, considering look of someone conducting a very serious evaluation. Adrian said very quietly, I hope I don't let him down. You will sometimes, she said. That's not a threat. That's just, you're a person. You'll fail him sometimes. The question is what you do with that. I know. He was still looking at Leo. I'm terrified of it. I know you are. Is that... He stopped. Is that okay? To say that out loud? It's better than not saying it, she said. A lot better. He nodded. Leo made a sound that was not quite a word, and not one. The experimental vocalizations of someone who has noticed that the people around him communicate in sounds and is beginning to attempt the same. Adrian made a sound back, just a low syllable, matching Leo's register. And Leo stilled, listening, his whole body oriented toward the voice. Evelyn watched them. She was not going to tell this story as a redemption arc. She knew too much about real life for that kind of tidiness. What had happened between her and Adrian was not a man learning a lesson and a woman forgiving him and everyone emerging better than before. It was messier than that. It was a woman who had left a situation that was making her disappear and rebuilt herself slowly and with difficulty, and then found herself pregnant and terrified and alone, and then not alone, and then, over months of accumulated ordinary moments, found herself watching a man she had known for 8 years become, gradually and imperfectly, someone she recognized. Someone who was underneath all the rest of it the whole time. Someone who had needed the loss of her to understand what he'd had, which was a terrible thing to need, and also simply true. She was not naive about what came next. She knew that love reformed after damage was not cleaner than the original. It had scar tissue in it, places that were thicker and less flexible, places that would ache when the weather changed. She knew that Adrian would fail her again in small ways, and possibly in large ones, and that the difference would be what they did together with the failure, whether they could say the true thing fast enough to keep the silence from growing back. She knew that she would fail him too, that she was not the wrong party in some simple accounting, that she had her own gaps, her own silences she defaulted to, her own ways of withdrawing when she felt threatened. The trust, as Marcus Webb apparently said, was a practice, and she was as unformed in it as Adrian was, and they were both going to have to learn it the same way Leo was learning to hold his head up, with effort, imperfectly, falling and trying again. She knew all of this. She looked at her son in the arms of his father on a December afternoon in the apartment she had chosen, in the life she had rebuilt, and she felt the full weight of what she was holding, not just the love, which was real and permanent and no longer in question, but the decision, the choice, the thing that was different from all the years before, when she had stayed because leaving was unthinkable and left because staying was impossible. Now she was choosing, with full information, with clear eyes, in a life that was entirely hers and did not need him in it to function. She was choosing him anyway. That was the difference. That was the whole of it. "Adrian," she said. He looked up. "After Leo goes down tonight," she said, "I want to talk more, not about logistics, just talk, the way we used to in that restaurant, before." He was quiet for a moment. She could see him taking it in, not strategizing around it, not calculating its implications, just receiving it. "Okay," he said. "I have wine," she said. "You can have the rest of my coffee if you want. We don't have to have a plan." "I don't need a plan," he said. "I know," she said. "That's why I said it." He looked at her, and this time the expression on his face had no name she could give it except that it was his. The unperformed face, the real one, the one she had caught in sideways glimpses throughout their years together and had wanted all along and was only now learning to simply ask for. He was not a fixed thing. Neither was she. They were two people who had hurt each other and survived it, and were sitting across a coffee table on a Sunday afternoon in December, deciding to try. Outside, the city was doing what cities do, enormous and ordinary and indifferent, full of people trying and failing and trying again, negotiating the terms of their lives in kitchens and law offices and hospital rooms and coffee shops and taxicabs on the FDR, in the particular private way that all of life's significant negotiations happen, without ceremony, without witness, one sentence at a time. Leo made a sound. Adrian made one back. Leo smiled. The social smile, the one that was supposed to be developmental, but felt, every time, like something more personal than that. Evelyn watched her son smile at his father. She thought about what it would mean for Leo to grow up watching two people choose each other on purpose, not because it was easy or because the past had been rewritten, or because love alone had solved something that love alone couldn't solve, but because they had looked honestly at each other and at themselves and had decided that becoming, slowly and without guarantee, something better was worth the effort of trying. She thought that was worth something. She thought, in fact, that it might be the most important thing a child could see. Not a perfect love, not a frictionless life, but two imperfect people who kept choosing to be honest with each other, who kept showing up, who learned late and with difficulty that you cannot hold on to someone the way you hold on to a possession, that the only way to keep a person is to give them room to leave and trust that if they stay, they're staying because they want to. She had wanted to leave. She had left. She was here. That was, she understood, the whole of the answer she'd been looking for. Later that evening, after Leo had been fed and changed and sung to, Adrian did this, a low, tuneless hum that was not any recognizable song, but that Leo accepted with the solemn attention he gave to most things Adrian did, as though taking notes. And after the apartment had settled into its nighttime quiet, they sat together on the couch, not far apart, not performing distance. She had wine. He had coffee because he had looked at the wine and said it would put him to sleep in 20 minutes, which was honest and made her laugh. The lamp in the corner was on and the rest of the apartment was dark, and outside the December wind was making its sound against the windows, and the building clanked in its way. They talked. Not about logistics, as she had said. About Rome, a little. She had asked what he remembered about that first evening, and he had said, "I was going to just find somewhere else to eat, and then I looked at you through the window and you were reading a book you weren't reading." She had said, "I noticed the book. I just had nothing to say about it." He had said, "I know. That's why I came in." They talked about Leo, not the weight and feeding schedule and developmental milestones, but the actual person who was appearing day by day in the body of their son. The way he seemed to find Adrian's voice specifically interesting, The way he looked at the ceiling fan with an expression that Evelyn had decided was skepticism. They talked about small things, work, the fourth station design. An acquisition Adrian was in the middle of that was more complicated than expected. Things that had no weight except the weight of being shared. The ordinary currency of two people letting each other into the texture of their days. Around 10:30, she said, "It's late." He looked at her. She looked at him. Neither of them said what they were not saying, which was that the couch was there, and the storm had moved on, and he didn't have to go anywhere. "Stay," she said. Same word as Tuesday, different weight. He understood the difference. "Okay," he said. She turned off the lamp. The room went dark in the way rooms go dark when the city still provides light through the windows, gray-blue and ambient. She could see his face in it. She could see the lamp on the table between them and the monitor blinking green and the ordinary objects of her apartment arranged in their familiar positions. She said, "I'm not the same person I was in that apartment." "I know," he said. "Neither am I. I need you to remember that. When it gets hard, when I do something that looks like the old pattern, check first whether it's the old pattern or whether it's just me, which is different." "Tell me the difference," he said. "I will," she said. "That's the whole thing. I'll tell you, and you tell me, and we don't let it sit in the silence long enough to grow." He nodded. She reached over and she took his hand. Just that. No ceremony, no significance manufactured out of the gesture. She was tired and it was late, and he was there, and she took his hand the way you take the hand of someone you are learning to trust again, which is the same way you take the hand of someone you never stopped. He held it. Outside, the city breathed its winter breath. Inside, the building clanked. The monitor blinked its green assurance. Somewhere in the bedroom, Leo slept, whole and warm, 3 months old, new to everything, doing the uncomplicated work of growing into himself. They sat in the quiet together. It was not perfect. It was not the end of difficulty or the beginning of something easy. It was two people, imperfect and changed and honest, in an apartment on a December night, learning what they might become. That was enough. More than enough. It was, in fact, everything.